Lisa Evans was driving home late one night from a family gathering in the quiet town of Maple Ridge, Maine. The winding country roads were deserted, with only the occasional streetlight flickering in the distance. It was one of those chilly, fog-covered evenings where everything felt eerie. Even the trees lining the road seemed to loom larger than usual, their branches stretching out like fingers. As she navigated a sharp curve, Lisa caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. A small figure standing by the side of the road. Her heart skipped a beat. At first, she thought it was a deer or an animal, but as she drew closer, she realized it was a young boy no older than 10, standing alone in the cold. He was wearing what appeared to be an old-fashioned jacket, the kind kids would have worn decades ago. His dark hair was matted and his face was pale, almost ghostly under the dim light. Lisa slowed the car, her mind racing with concern. What was a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere, at this hour, all alone? She pulled over to the side of the road and rolled down her window. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The boy didn't respond. He just stood there, staring blankly ahead, not even acknowledging her presence. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the way he was standing so still, so unnaturally calm, made her uneasy. "Do you live around here?" she tried again. "Are you lost?" This time the boy slowly turned his head toward her, his eyes meeting hers. His gaze was vacant, emotionless, but something about those eyes was deeply unsettling. They seemed too old for a child, as if they had seen things no one should ever witness. Against her better judgment, Lisa decided to step out of the car. She couldn't just leave him there, no matter how strange the situation seemed. She approached him cautiously, the gravel crunching under her feet. As she got closer, she noticed something odd. The boy's clothes looked worn, not just old-fashioned, but frayed, as if they had been through years of wear and tear. There were patches of dirt on his pants and a tear in his jacket. "Are you lost?" she asked again, trying to keep her voice steady. "Where's your family?" The boy remained silent. His eyes seemed to follow her every move, but his expression never changed. Lisa felt her anxiety rising, a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. She reached out to touch his shoulder, hoping to get his attention. But the moment her fingers brushed his jacket, a coldness unlike anything she had ever felt shot through her. It wasn't just the chilly night air. It was as if her hand had dipped into ice water, a deep, bone-chilling cold. She pulled her hand back in shock, staring at him. And then, without warning, the boy turned and started walking down the road. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, like he was following a path he had walked 1,000 times before. The fog seemed to thicken around him as he moved, swallowing him up until he was barely visible. Lisa hesitated. Part of her wanted to follow him, to make sure he was okay, but another part, the part that had felt that unnatural cold, told her to get back in the car and leave. Something about this boy wasn't right. She called out one last time, "Wait, where are you going?" The boy didn't answer. He just kept walking, disappearing into the fog. Lisa stood there for a moment, frozen with indecision, before finally turning back to her car. She got in, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. She sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm her racing heart. Maybe she should call the police, she thought. But what would she tell them? That she saw a strange boy on the side of the road who vanished into the fog? Deciding it was best to leave, Lisa started the car and drove off, her mind still replaying the strange encounter. She glanced in her rearview mirror a few times, half expecting to see the boy standing in the road behind her, but there was nothing, just the fog and the empty road stretching out behind her. For the next few days, Lisa couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Something about the whole experience gnawed at her, a lingering unease she couldn't shake. She started asking around town, trying to see if anyone knew of a missing child or if anyone had seen the boy, but no one seemed to know anything. It was as if the boy didn't exist. Then, one evening, she mentioned the incident to her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, who had lived in Maple Ridge for her entire life. When Lisa described the boy, his old-fashioned clothes, his pale face, Mrs. Callahan's expression changed. She grew quiet, her face growing pale as she listened. "You said he was wearing an old jacket and his hair was dark?" Mrs. Callahan asked slowly. Lisa nodded, confused by her reaction. "Yes, why? Do you know who he is?" Callahan took a deep breath before answering. There's an old story about a boy who used to live in this town. His name was Thomas Jenkins, and he died on that very road over 50 years ago. Lisa's stomach dropped. What? How did he die? He was walking home from school one foggy afternoon, and he was hit by a car. The driver never saw him through the fog, and by the time they found him, it was too late. He was buried in the town cemetery, but there's always been talk that his spirit still wanders that road. People say they've seen him, especially on foggy nights, standing by the side of the road just like you described. A chill ran down Lisa's spine. But that can't be. I saw him. He was real. He looked alive. Mrs. Callahan shook her head. Many people have seen him over the years, but it's always the same. He never speaks, never interacts, just stares or walks away. Some believe he's still looking for his way home, trapped between this world and the next. Lisa sat there in stunned silence. The boy she had seen wasn't just lost, he was a ghost, a restless spirit from a tragic past. From that day on, Lisa avoided that road at night, especially when the fog rolled in. But she never forgot the boy with the pale face and old jacket, still wandering the road, searching for the home he would never reach. And sometimes, when the fog is thick and the air is cold, she wonders if she'll see him again, standing by the side of the road, waiting for someone to help him find his way. Jenny and her husband Tom had recently moved to a quiet, rural town in Maine. After years of living in the city, they were eager for a slower pace of life. Their new home sat on the edge of a serene lake, surrounded by thick woods, and it seemed like the perfect escape. It was an old colonial-style house with large windows overlooking the water, a long wooden dock, and a wraparound porch. It didn't take long for the couple to fall in love with their new place. The house was peaceful, with the sound of birds in the morning and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the lake. However, it wasn't long before Jenny began to feel uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. One afternoon, Jenny sat on the porch, enjoying the sunset. The lake shimmered in hues of orange and pink as the last rays of the sun stretched across the horizon. As she sat there lost in thought, her eyes drifted to a figure standing at the far end of the dock. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He stood perfectly still, facing the water, dressed in a dark, old-fashioned suit. His presence was so out of place that Jenny blinked several times, thinking she must be imagining it. But the figure remained, unmoving, its silhouette stark against the fading light. She called out to him, thinking maybe it was a neighbor she hadn't met yet. "Hello?" she shouted, her voice carrying over the still lake. The figure didn't respond, didn't even seem to acknowledge her. Feeling a shiver run down her spine, Jenny stood up and walked toward the dock. But by the time she reached it, the man was gone. Confused and unsettled, she glanced around, scanning the shoreline, but there was no sign of him. The lake was silent, with only the soft lapping of water against the dock. That night, she told Tom about the strange man. He laughed it off, teasing her that maybe it was a fisherman or a local out for a late evening stroll. But Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man had appeared so suddenly and vanished just as quickly. The next few days passed uneventfully, though Jenny couldn't stop thinking about the figure by the lake. She began spending more time indoors, only venturing out to the dock in the early mornings or afternoons, hoping to avoid any more unsettling encounters. A week later, Jenny saw him again. It was late in the evening, just after dusk, and she had been closing the curtains in the living room when she spotted the figure. He was standing at the end of the dock in the exact same spot as before, facing the water. This time, Jenny felt a surge of fear course through her. The way he stood there, so still, so silent, sent a cold chill down her spine. She called Tom over, her voice shaking. "He's there again, Tom. Look." Tom joined her by the window, but when he looked out, there was no one there. "I don't see anyone," he said, frowning. "But he was just there," Jenny insisted, her heart racing. "I saw him. He was standing right at the end of the dock." Tom tried to reassure her, suggesting it was just her imagination or a trick of the light. But Jenny knew what she had seen. That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, set her on edge. She kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see the figure standing outside, watching her. A few days later, while Tom was at work, Jenny decided to take matters into her own hands. She grabbed her camera and went out to the dock, determined to prove to herself and to Tom that she wasn't imagining things. As she reached the end of the dock, the air felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. The water, usually calm and reflective, seemed unusually dark, almost like ink. Jenny stood there for a while, her camera ready, waiting for any sign of the mysterious figure. And then she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her skin prickled as she slowly turned her head, and there he was again. This time, the figure stood not at the end of the dock, but near the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. He was closer than before, and Jenny could make out more details. The old-fashioned suit, the unnaturally still posture, and the pale, almost glowing skin. Her heart pounded in her chest as she raised the camera, trying to steady her trembling hands. She snapped a photo, but when she looked down at the screen, the figure wasn't there. The clearing where he stood was empty in the photo. Frustrated and frightened, Jenny looked back up, but the man was gone. She hurried back inside, her hands shaking. When Tom returned home that evening, she showed him the photo, trying to explain what had happened. But the lack of evidence only made him more skeptical. "Jenny, it's probably just your nerves," Tom said gently. "Moving to a new place can be stressful. Maybe you're seeing things that aren't really there." But Jenny knew better. The man wasn't a figment of her imagination. He was real, and she could feel his presence growing stronger. Over the next few weeks, Jenny became more obsessed with the figure by the lake. She researched the history of the area, hoping to find some clue as to who or what he was. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. In the early 1900s, a man named Ethan Turner had lived in a cabin near the lake. He had been a recluse, rarely interacting with the townspeople, and was rumored to be involved in dark practices. One evening, his cabin had burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances, and his body was never found. Some claimed he had perished in the fire, while others believed he had vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. But there were those who whispered that Ethan Turner's spirit still lingered by the lake, waiting for something or someone. Jenny's heart sank as she read through old newspaper clippings and town records. The figure she had been seeing matched the description of Ethan Turner, his old-fashioned clothing, his pale appearance. She realized that whatever haunted the lake had been there for over a century. That night, Jenny made a decision. She could no longer live in the house by the lake, knowing that the figure was always watching. She and Tom packed their bags and moved out the next day, leaving the haunting memories behind. But even after they had left, Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan Turner's spirit was still out there, waiting by the lake, watching for the next person to come along. And as they drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him, standing at the edge of the woods, watching their car disappear into the distance. The figure by the lake was not gone. It would never be gone. Had always been fascinated by old houses, so when she inherited her grandmother's Victorian-era home in a small town in Vermont, she was excited. The house was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown gardens and towering oak trees. It was the kind of place that held memories, secrets even, and Emma was eager to start a new chapter of her life in this family home. The house was everything she had hoped for, grand, full of character, and just a bit mysterious. It had been uninhabited for years, ever since her grandmother had passed, but it was in surprisingly good condition. There was only one part of the house Emma felt uneasy about, the attic. Her grandmother had always warned her never to go up there. When she was a child, her grandmother would say, "Emma, that attic is no place for children. There are things up there better left undisturbed." Now, as an adult, Emma wasn't so sure what her grandmother had meant. The house was hers, and she felt compelled to explore every corner, including the attic. She shrugged off her childhood fears and convinced herself that the stories her grandmother had told were just to keep her from poking around in dangerous old furniture or dusty boxes. However, the attic was still unsettling. Whenever Emma climbed the stairs toward the attic door, the air would grow heavier, colder. It was as though the house itself didn't want her to go up there. After a few days of settling into the house, Emma finally worked up the courage to venture into the attic. She climbed the creaky staircase, flashlight in hand, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. A wave of cold air hit her, sending a chill down her spine, but she pressed on. The attic was vast, filled with old trunks, furniture draped in white sheets, and dusty heirlooms from generations past. Sunlight filtered through the small window at the far end of the room, casting long shadows across the floor. Emma felt a strange sense of unease as she walked through the space as if she were not alone. She began to explore, opening old trunks and sifting through family relics. There were faded photographs, handwritten letters, and antique clothes. It was like stepping into a time capsule. And then she found something strange. Tucked away in the corner, beneath an old wooden wardrobe, was a small, intricately carved box. It was beautiful, but something about it felt off. The carvings were unusual, almost disturbing, swirling patterns that seemed to move if she stared at them for too long. There was no lock, so Emma opened the box. Inside was a small, delicate pendant on a tarnished silver chain. It looked like it had been forgotten for decades. As she held the pendant in her hand, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. The temperature in the attic seemed to drop even further, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She put the pendant back in the box and quickly closed the lid. She felt an urge to leave the attic immediately, but as she turned to go, she heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. "Help me." Emma froze. The voice was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen, but the attic had fallen silent again. She turned back toward the box, her hands trembling. Had the voice come from inside the box? Or was it just her imagination playing tricks on her? Trying to shake off the fear, Emma hurried down the stairs and out of the attic, locking the door behind her. She told herself that it was just the wind or maybe the old house settling, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed louder, every gust of wind outside more ominous. She tossed and turned in bed, her mind replaying the moment in the attic over and over again. And then, just as she was starting to drift off, she heard it. "Help. Me." The voice was louder this time, clearer. It was coming from above her, from the attic. Emma sat bolt upright in bed, her heart racing. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with fear. The voice continued, soft but insistent. "Help me." Gathering her courage, Emma grabbed her flashlight and slowly made her way up the stairs. Her hands shook as she unlocked the attic door and stepped inside. The room was dark, the air cold and oppressive. She shined her flashlight around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw it. Standing near the small window at the far end of the attic was a figure, a woman dressed in a tattered white gown. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and full of sorrow. She stared at Emma, her lips moving silently as if pleading for help. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The woman stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. As she drew nearer, Emma could hear the faint whisper again. "Help. Me." The woman reached out her hand, and Emma saw that she was holding the pendant from the box, her ghostly fingers wrapped around it, clutching it tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she lifted the pendant, offering it to Emma. Her eyes were filled with desperation, as if she was begging for release, for peace. Emma hesitated, but something deep inside her told her to take the pendant. Slowly, she reached out and took it from the ghostly figure. The moment her fingers closed around it, the woman began to fade, her form dissolving into the shadows of the attic. For a long moment, Emma stood there in the dark, clutching the pendant, her mind racing with what had just happened. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, as if the house itself had relaxed, its long-held tension released. The next morning, Emma researched the history of the house and discovered a tragic story. Decades ago, a young woman named Clara Davis had lived in the house. She had been engaged to a man who had died under mysterious circumstances just weeks before their wedding. Heartbroken, Clara had retreated to the attic, where she spent her final days in isolation. She had died in that very attic, clutching the pendant her fiancé had given her. It was said that Clara's spirit had never found peace, and some believed she still haunted the house, searching for a way to reunite with her lost love. Emma knew now that the pendant held the key to Clara's release. She had unknowingly disturbed the spirit when she found it, but by accepting it, she had given Clara the peace she had sought for so long. From that day forward, the house felt different. The cold, oppressive feeling that had once lingered in the attic was gone, replaced by a sense of warmth and tranquility. Emma knew that Clara had finally found her rest, but sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent and the wind whispered through the trees, Emma could still hear it, the faintest of voices whispering softly, "Thank you." Sarah Thompson, a young professional living in Denver, Colorado, had recently moved into a new apartment in the heart of the city. It was an old historic building with creaky wooden floors and ornate moldings. Charming, but a bit eerie at night. Sarah was attracted to the vintage architecture and the spacious layout, but she soon learned that this apartment had a long history, one that was hidden beneath its polished exterior. A few weeks after she moved in, Sarah started to notice strange things happening late at night. At first it was subtle, a light flickering here, the faint sound of footsteps above her when there shouldn't have been anyone there. She shrugged it off, assuming it was the quirks of an old building. After all, old pipes and creaky floors weren't unusual. But one night around midnight, something much more unnerving happened. Sarah was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone when she heard the distinct sound of someone walking down the hallway outside her bedroom. It was slow and deliberate, the floorboards groaning under the weight of each step. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the door, expecting it to creak open any second. But nothing happened. Silence settled over the apartment, thick and heavy. Sarah got up, cautiously walking to the door and opening it, but the hallway was empty. The strange thing was, she lived alone, and the building's security system was tight. No one should have been able to get in. A few nights later, things escalated. Sarah was having a late-night glass of wine and trying to unwind from a stressful day. The moonlight streamed in through the large windows, casting long shadows across the room. As she sat there, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the reflection of the window. She whipped her head around, and that's when she saw her, a woman standing at the far end of the room, near the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The woman was tall and striking, dressed in a red, floor-length gown that looked like it belonged to another era, something straight out of the 1920s. Her dark hair was styled in loose waves, and her face, though beautiful, held an expression of deep sadness. Sarah froze, gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. She blinked, and the woman was gone, vanished as quickly as she had appeared. But the eerie feeling in the air remained, and Sarah could still smell a faint, floral perfume that lingered in the room, a scent she hadn't noticed before. Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued to see the woman. She would catch glimpses of her in mirrors, reflections, or out of the corner of her eye. The lady in the red dress never spoke or moved directly toward her. She just stood there watching, always with that same mournful expression. Sarah started to feel like she was losing her grip on reality. Was she imagining it? Was she seeing things? One night, after another unsettling encounter, Sarah decided to do some digging. She visited the local library and researched the history of her building. What she found sent chills down her spine. The building had once been a grand hotel in the 1920s, a hotspot for Denver's elite. But in 1927, a young woman named Margaret Davenport, the wife of a wealthy businessman, had tragically died in one of the hotel suites, Suite 303, which coincidentally was now Sarah's apartment. According to the old newspapers, Margaret had thrown a lavish party the night of her death. She had worn a stunning red gown, the same dress Sarah had seen in her visions. Margaret's death was shrouded in mystery. Some said she had taken her own life after discovering her husband's infidelity. Others whispered that she had been murdered in a fit of jealous rage. The truth was never fully uncovered, and her death remained one of Denver's unsolved mysteries. After learning this, Sarah became obsessed with Margaret's story. She read every article she could find, piecing together the tragic life of the woman who had once lived and died within the same walls. The sightings of Margaret became more frequent, and Sarah began to feel a deeper connection to the spirit, as if Margaret was trying to communicate with her, to tell her something. One particularly stormy night, Sarah woke up to the sound of soft crying. The room was cold, unnaturally cold, and the air felt thick with an oppressive presence. She sat up in bed, and there, at the foot of the bed, was Margaret, her face streaked with tears, her red gown glowing faintly in the dim light. Sarah felt a wave of sadness wash over her, almost as if the emotions of this long-dead woman were pouring into her. "Why are you here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. For the first time, Margaret's lips moved, but no sound came out. She raised a hand, pointing toward the window, her expression pleading, desperate. Sarah got up, drawn to the window by some invisible force. She looked down into the street below, and that's when she saw him, a man standing in the rain, staring up at her apartment. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face partially hidden by the brim of his hat, but even from that distance, Sarah could feel his eyes on her. A shiver ran down her spine. She closed the curtains quickly and turned back to Margaret, but the apparition was gone. The next day, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. She had read enough about hauntings to know that spirits with unfinished business often tried to communicate with the living. Margaret's death had been a mystery for nearly a century, and Sarah was beginning to believe that Margaret was showing her the truth. Determined to find answers, Sarah reached out to a local historian who specialized in unsolved crimes. Together, they uncovered new evidence about Margaret's husband, Jonathan Davenport, who had been suspected of foul play but had never been charged. Witnesses from the time had mentioned seeing a strange man outside the hotel the night Margaret died, a man who matched the description of the figure Sarah had seen in the street. With this new information, Sarah began to put the pieces together. She believed that Jonathan had hired someone to kill Margaret, covering up the crime as a suicide. And now, nearly 100 years later, Margaret's spirit was still trapped, seeking justice for her untimely death. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah decided to confront the spirit one last time. She lit candles around the apartment and sat in the center of the room, calling out to Margaret. "I know what happened to you," she said softly. "I know you were betrayed." The air grew cold, and the faint scent of floral perfume filled the room. Margaret appeared once more, her red gown billowing softly as she stood in front of Sarah, but this time her expression had changed. She no longer looked sad. There was a hint of gratitude in her eyes. "Rest now," Sarah whispered. "I'll make sure people know the truth." With that, Margaret's form began to fade, her outline growing fainter until she was gone, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of the past. The air in the apartment seemed lighter. The oppressive feeling lifted. Sarah stayed in the apartment for another year, but she never saw Margaret again. The haunting had ended, but Margaret Davenport's story would live on, thanks to Sarah's determination to uncover the truth. And every now and then, when the wind howls late at night, Sarah still thinks she hears the faint echo of a woman's voice, whispering a final thank you from beyond the grave. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.